Good afternoon all, and welcome to Studio Tate's webinar, Sustainability in Design, the Rise of Mass Timber. We're very excited to be hosting our second webinar for 2020. A little bit about mass timber. The way projects are being delivered in Australia is rapidly changing with the emergence of mass timber, an environmentally friendly alternative to conventional structural systems. Mass timber encompasses a suite of building elements that can transform relatively low value timber feedstock into structural elements that have superior weight to strength performance than steel or concrete. The industry is excited about mass timber as it offers an opportunity to build smarter and more sustainably into the future. Mass timber takes design into the realm of digital off-site fabrication and has significant sustainable benefits as they are manufactured from a renewable resource and with a low carbon footprint. Today's webinar is designed to share how some of the key aspects of mass timber come together in a project: architecture, structural design, moisture control, fire testing, acoustic design, installation, feasibility and cost. We hope that you enjoy listening to the shared experiences that all contribute to advancing our understanding of mass timber in the local construction industry. We, Studio Tate, are delighted to welcome our cross-disciplinary, passionate expert panel of collaborators and past colleagues and friends. Representing architecture, we have Simon Topless, Associate Director at Jackson Clements Burrows. Give us a wave, Simon. Project Management, Ryan, Senior Project Manager at Duo Projects. Hi, Ryan. Representing Cost, we have Lisa, who's an associate at Slattery. Hi Lisa, how are you? And Structural, Nigel Burden, Technical Director of Building Structures at AECOM. Hi Nigel, how are you? Now I'm just going to share my screen. We have a presentation which the guys have all put together some slides, so just give me a moment. I'm going to pull that up. If I have it open, but I just can't see it, of course. Yeah. Sorry, give me a moment, everyone. Here we are. Now, I'm hoping everyone can see that. Simon, I'm going to hand over to you. Can you see that there?
Absolutely, that's great, Alex.
Great.
Thanks, Alex, for that great introduction, and a big hello to all my fellow panel members today. It should be a really good discussion, and thank you, Studio Tate, for inviting us along and for everybody joining us today. JCB has been on the mass timber journey for now about 3 years, since sort of mid-2017. It's been a fantastic journey for us. We've completed during that period about $120 million worth of built projects. It's seen us deliver sort of two, we think, certainly Victoria's largest mass timber projects, and we have a lot of other projects in the wings. Personally, it's taken me, I've been very lucky to travel to Italy and Southwest Austria to meet the major producers in Austria and Italy, and to work with them over this period and gain from their experience and their history in mass timber, which is certainly far longer than ours in Australia. Maybe next slide. Great. Our first project that we embarked on in mid-2017 was Gillies Hall, and this has probably received a fair bit of press over the last, especially sort of 18 months since it opened. And a project that has been quite incredible for us in sort of beginning this journey. It was delivered for Monash University, and they really began, I suppose, the conversation with us and opened up the possibility of a mass timber student accommodation building at their Peninsula campus. It was also on this project, sustainability was a really key feature, and they were asking us to pursue Passive House certification. And obviously mass timber as a sustainable material and with a low carbon footprint really aligned to this sort of the principles of the project, really sort of targeting Monash's 2030 net zero agenda. But as we went through the design and detailing, we sort of found that these two really sort of aspirational sustainability agendas were really well matched. The mass timber played a great role in contributing to our facade design and achieving really, really high performing facades that didn't transfer heat between the internal and external spaces. It was a journey of really learning about mass timber's limitations in terms of acoustics, but it's also its possibilities in terms of what it can actually lend to spaces. and sort of began our understanding of how mass timber buildings really go together. And also began, I suppose, our relationship in this with multiplex construction. Maybe next slide. The second project, which is really sort of, I suppose, been quite transformative for us now, is La Trobe, which we continued this relationship with multiplex also. So the La Trobe student accommodation project is 2 buildings comprising of a total of 624 beds, student accommodation buildings again, and continue this journey of mass timber. La Trobe, probably at the start of the journey, didn't know that they were going to get a mass timber building, but we sort of managed to take them on that journey through that sort of early schematic design phase, and sort of brought them the story of one, the sustainability credentials of mass timber and how it could be employed on the project, and I think how they could actually provide leadership in the space and sort of build on the sustainability agenda which they brought to the project, which was really targeting more 5-star Green Star, and it sort of aligned to their principles as a university. And then as a result gave us, I think, a really sort of fantastic outcome on site. The journey for us on this project is really with Multiplex, our Italian supplier, XLM Dolomiti, also Wood Solutions from Melbourne as well, has really been about a learning experience, learning how these buildings go together and building on the knowledge from Gillies Hall, our sort of early experience, into La Trobe, which is a much more complex building. You can see that from the form. And also the sort of the quantities of construction that we were talking about in terms of mass timber was 4,500 cubic metres of mass timber, or we had enough panels to cover the MCG pitch twice on this project. So it's been so far a 3.5-year journey. It's continuing. We've got schools that are going out to tender at the moment. We've got other projects in design, and it's a journey that we're really excited about.
Thank you, Simon. Lisa, you're muted, my dear.
Thank you. Hi guys, Lisa here. So one of the projects that I'm really lucky to be involved in is the new student precinct for Melbourne Uni. So the project itself is 7 buildings all up, but on the screen, that's Doug McDonald on the side, where there's the atrium and the canopy, and on to the right, that is ERC. So for this project, unfortunately, we are in construction and we aren't using mass timber, but mass timber was explored all the way up to design development. So in the structure itself, in Dougmac, there was going to be some CRT slabs and some stairs, and the beams and columns were going to be glulam. However, at the end of DD, there were some potential delays with approvals with the Timber Appeals Board. So just because of some timing, we did decide to go down the path of structural steel, which was unfortunate. But I think a lesson learned is if you do want to go down the timber path, to talk to contractors early and make sure that you understand all the risks potentially with timber. However, the facade itself does have timber mullions, so the timber look and feel is still in the precinct. So next slide. This is another project that I'm currently working on, which is just in construction now. So this is the Darabin Multi-Sport Stadium. So as you can see, there's a lot of structural steel, but there is a little bit of glulam columns and beams in the show court. So I think just one thing to note, structure doesn't always have to be one or the other. I think there can be hybrids. So if timber, and more people use timber on projects, it becomes more prevalent in the industry and people are not so scared of using it. And it can always be used as, you know, an element in the design. So as you can see there in the show courts, the beams and columns are glulam, and then the rest of the structure is structural steel. Yeah, that's just like some of my projects that I've worked on. So I'll pass on to Nigel from ACON.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. My background actually was originally working overseas on complex geometry structures, and I really enjoy working with designers on unusual projects, and I'm lucky to work on some pretty weird and wonderful ones. But when I moved to Australia about 8 years ago, I was really attracted to get back to timber design. You know, I felt that a lot of the really nice design work happening at the moment is in the timber space. I'm very passionate about the sustainability benefits, and clearly business as usual isn't going to be the future of construction. And it's a really exciting material to be working in right now as the industry matures and the technology develops as well. And it's really good to be part of that. I got going on a couple of really interesting little projects. You can see on the left there, the Swinburne Factories of the Future project, which was affectionately known as Pac-Man in my office. It was a 2-story spherical plywood ball with meeting rooms in it, which was a fantastic job. Did a timber structure with Wesley College dining hall with express trusses. But I was lucky enough to lead the Bunjil Place project you see in the middle here in Narrawarren with FJ&T Architects. And, it was a huge free-form ridge shell structure that made up the main foyer. And it really pushed the boundaries of timber, not only here in Australia, but internationally. The curved glulam was imported out of Germany. And ended up getting the National Timber Award that year. So it was a real sort of career highlight. Next slide, please. So having done a few of those sort of niche projects, I've actually really moved into the commercial mass timber space, working with ACOM in the last few years. And I've been essentially leading a multidiscipline team on the Ballarat Gov Hub project over the last 2 years, which is just nearing completion now. This was the first major government project in timber and was a really exciting opportunity to work with government and explore the possibilities for mass timber in a commercial office environment. It's a 5-story project, which is about $100 million in value over about 15,000 square meters. So some pretty sizable floor plates as well. We adopted a 9 by 9 meter grid on this project, which is about as big an office grid as has been achieved in Australia at this point in time, using a glue laminate post and beam system and CLT floor plates. As Lisa mentioned, we used a hybrid of systems as well and mixed and match because there were a lot of pretty ambitious architectural moves by JWA architects. And Development Victoria is really rolling this out as their template for sort of an exemplar mass timber office building, and with Bendigo Gov Hub coming off the back of it. Yep. Next slide, please. So, and there's some really good learnings out of this that I'll briefly share. There is no reason why you can't have a really decent grid on using mass timber with the 9 by 9. Having worked overseas, the Australian construction industry is pretty lean and mean here and delivers buildings pretty efficiently. But when you're doing these timber jobs at the moment, while it's developing, you really need a team of people that's willing to go back to first principles. So it's important to have a team with the right mindset. Commercial floor plates with timber beams currently also require a lot of coordination, getting the mechanical ducting around the floor plate. So we found ACOM delivered this job as a full multidisciplinary package that worked extremely well because fire, acoustic, structure services had to work very closely with each other. And pragmatic use of timber, use it where it makes sense, and don't try and use it elsewhere. We got a lot of positive feedback from the builder. You can see a variety of schemes that we investigated along the way before it remained full mass timber for the floor plates, but we have steel roof, concrete cores, and the builder really sort of appreciated that. Last slide. And so briefly, just the projects I'm currently working on. I'm working on 36 Wellington Street in Collingwood, which just got a planning permit. It's a 15-story building that's predominantly mass timber. I'm the internal peer reviewer for Auckland City Mission, which is the job you see on the right there. That's a 10-story, very high-profile project in central Auckland. And the interesting element of that was it was major seismic design. So we had seismic engineering on top of everything else to worry about. And also another 10-story building in the city fringe. And lastly, we're also involved in a project internally looking at embodied carbon assessments. And what's interesting is how much of the carbon footprint for the life cycle of the project was actually tied up in the structure, and really looking at getting in early and communicating to the client what it means to go for timber versus some of the more conventional material systems. That's a snapshot of me.
Ryan, over to you.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Didn't really expect to be spending the first day out of lockdown sitting in a room alone and just talking to myself, but at least in this instance, it's good to know that there's an audience out there, because I assure you the walls are sick of listening to me. Also, I am currently holed up in a side office and I've lost the lighting in here, so apologies for that.
No worries, Ryan,
but
we can see you and your lovely face, so all good.
So in talking timber, I suppose as that first image would suggest, my sort of experience started on it on the 1st of May back in 2017, when the brief for the new Peninsula Resi job landed on my desk. And having read that and chatting to Richard at the time, who was a project director at Monash, he mentioned that, the job would be perfect for CLT, and I agreed with him wholeheartedly and made a note of my to-do list saying, check why CLT is perfect for this job. And of course, Wikipedia is the first port of call out of all places generally to look things up. But also at the time, I recall that a couple of Nigel's colleagues, Jochen and Mark, had done a timber talk and a presentation I couldn't really get myself to, but I did reach out to Mark, and I'm not saying it's because AECOM wanted to try to get onto the project, but Mark and Jochen were happy to just sit in a small room at AECOM's office and just give me this presentation, sort of just the two of them to me, which is an incredible experience. And learning from that, then we sort of slipped it into the consultant RFPs to explore a timber structure on Gillies Hall. And from there, I think if you go to the next page, there it's really a massive credit to JCB, AECOM and Multiplex for pulling off what was honestly a miracle to get that designed and built in 19 months. It wasn't just the mass timbers, sort of Simon touched on before, it is passive house as well. So I just definitely don't recommend anyone try to take on two very ambitious agendas with such a constrained time frame. But some of the key takeaways coming out of that project, whether it's passive house, whether it's mass timber, or both of them combined, was that collaboration really was the key on that project for delivery. And I mean, that's true for any project, but when you think of mass timber, I mean, even something simple as, you missed a penetration for a service, you're going to be able to core through timber a lot easier than concrete, but especially if you want to expose the timber, it's not a great outcome. So in terms of getting on the front foot and collaborating top to bottom on a design is quite important, but also that the market is still quite immature, and it's important to engage with the industry early. And that's sort of how I started off my spiel, and sort of reaching out and asking questions. And we're lucky to work in an industry where we're generally quite happy to share our knowledge with each other just for the betterment of the industry. So always just feel free to reach out and ask questions. And relating to timber, there's also Wood Solutions, which is a advisory resource that don't charge anything, but they're very knowledgeable individuals in there who'll be happy to talk all things timber. But applying that also in terms of the project delivery, sort of considering procurement options. Do you go for an early contract involvement? Engaging with the suppliers early? Do you want to limit yourself to European supply or local supply, or get the best of both worlds and keep it open to yourself? So after delivering that, and going on to the next slide, please. I've been lucky enough to continue working on some timber projects. So the first one is Collingwood, Wellington Street in Collingwood, where we're working with JCB and AECOM, and the other project was still going through planning, so I'll leave the address confidential, but I'm working with Woods Bagot and AECOM there. Might need to work with somebody else but AECOM on the next project, or I might not have engineers tendering for me in the future, but I'll keep that to the fourth job, I suppose. But coming off from a panelized and sort of more modular design, going into a post and beam type of design was a bit of a learning curve as well, because your mindset sort of needs to adjust. And, working with Nigel on this, on the engineering, has been quite brilliant, to be honest. But with planning done on one project and hopefully coming soon on the other, The next challenge really is challenges Lisa came up with at the student precinct. It's getting tall timber buildings approved and everything being referred to the Building Appeals Board at the moment, anything over 25 meters. So hopefully get over that challenge and we'll get these buildings built in the coming years.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm just going to stop screen sharing and we're going to now have a bit of a discussion. And I think just to kick off, a few questions I've jotted a few things down as everyone was chatting. And I guess this first question might be directed to you, Simon, or maybe even yourself, Ryan. When a project, you sort of touched on it, Simon, when you were chatting, you know, initially it's not necessarily, hey, I've got a project and I'd like to do it in CLT. I mean, the Monash one was obviously a significant project. Did you guys, just to be clear, take them down that pathway and suggest it and take them on that journey? And is that how most of your projects have come to fruition with mass timber?
No, I think Ryan touched on it. I think we were very lucky that both Ryan and Richard, his project manager boss at Monash, were interested in mass timber at the time.
And so has that been the case for all of the JCB projects? No,
I think that gave us, I think, you know, that's given us the leg and the leg up in the space. You know, we had an amazing client who was committed to the project, committed to the agenda, and basically said, we've got a ridiculous time frame on this project, but if you can make it work, we'll back it. You know, as long as it's not going to cost an arm and a leg over. And we proved it through, you know, some early logistic studies and some early cost analysis during ESD that there wasn't any cost issues with the project, and it actually bought us some time in design. That it was possible. But then from there, I think now that we've done a project, there's a level of confidence that clients have. So we were able to take La Trobe on that journey with us. And, you know, we could say at the time we have a project under construction. This is why we think we can do it. And I think now that we've done that, you know, there is this huge perception of risk out there with regards to mass timber projects. And it pisses me off in a way. Because it's risk that's driven a lot of the time by project managers and QSs and around procurement and around cost. And there's also risk around the Building Appeals Board, et cetera, and everybody sort of sees red flags. And so many projects fall over early. I think, you know, it helps tremendously if you've got a client and you can find what engages that client, whether it's their sustainability agenda. I think with regards to La Trobe, you know, there was one was sustainability and two was market leadership. You've got the chance here to do one of the biggest CLT projects not just in Victoria, but in Australia. And quite frankly, a couple of years ago, this would have been one of the biggest projects in Europe and across the globe. You know, so for them, it was about market leadership, and they were able to show market leadership, demonstrate it in mass timber and sustainability. So I think if you can find those little kernels to guide the clients on, that really helps, because you are going to have the detractors out there. Yep. The people who are going to put up the red flags. There's only one supplier in Australia. Yeah, but there's loads in Europe and they're actually cheaper. So you can get over all those hurdles. You can get over the BAB, the fire hurdles, the acoustics. You've just got to work out what the kernels are and how to play the game.
And just to your point there around the supply of the right timber for doing mass timber projects, I know that you've mentioned the company in Italy that you've used on these few projects, and obviously the sustainability aspect of working in timber. How do you reconcile that in terms of, you know, the product coming over on a ship or a plane, however it gets here, and that impact on the environment versus then obviously you're I suppose making up ground by building in timber. So how do you reconcile that then in your office at JCB and then also on the projects?
Yeah, sure. No, really good question. Do you want me to answer that, Ryan, or are you?
I was gonna jump in and set you up for that, but I'll just mention that something that Nigel's doing just on the embodied energy. It's in terms of adopting that. If you look at an equivalent concrete building and accounting for the carbon you produce compared to the embodied energy in CLT and offset that against I don't know, whatever it is tons per container, factor that into the calculation. But yeah.
Oh, no, I mean, I think
what we have actually found is the transport does make a big difference, but it's playing the long game, right? Like we need to be building timber buildings. Like the difference in terms of carbon footprint of a locally sourced timber building is so significant, but we're not going to make it happen just by clicking our fingers. And we're already finding we've got XLAM and a number of suppliers joining the market, and they're developing off the back of these projects. And it's absolutely fine that we're sourcing it from Europe now. We need to get the ball rolling, and that's exactly what's happened. And that supported the local suppliers to get going. So I personally have absolutely no problem with sourcing the material from Europe at the moment, but I would very much hope that in 5-10 years time, that's a very different equation. And really,
I think that's it. I think our local suppliers need the confidence that they are able to set up, that they are able to get projects going.
Well,
so
it's supply and demand, isn't it?
It is. It's exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And what sort of, I suppose, conditions are required to make the right timber for mass timber constructions? Is Australia an appropriate climate and, to do it?
That's a big question.
Is it too big a question for a quick forum?
I mean, Australia's timber, I think the XLAM is supplied from managed forests up in Queensland from Hines. I think there's a CLT glulam plants which is starting up out of, which is really exciting, starting up out of Tasmania using hardwoods. I think they're coming online next year. I think that's going to be really exciting for the Australian market. There's glulam production in Australia using hardwoods. Nigel would probably be better at talking about that. I think why the industry took off like it has in Austria and northern Italy is because Austria identified that 25-30 years ago they have this incredible resource that I think it's something like 43% of their land mass is covered in spruce forest, pretty much. And they realised that their timber industry was probably one of their greatest possibilities for growth, sustainable growth. And so they invested heavily in that, or encouraged invested heavily in that. So I think that's the thing at the moment, where we're sourcing from natural forests in Italy, and in southern Austria that are essentially sustainable. Hopefully we'll have a point in Australia where we'll have very similar conditions here. And I think, but it's just going to take time.
Yeah. And we touched on it just a moment ago when Simon and Ryan, you were talking about the commitment for a client up front. I think over to you, Lisa. What is your thoughts around whether mass timber is more expensive? You touched on it as an introduction point around timeline and making sure that there's the right time to explore mass timber from a design and documentation point of view and delivery. But what about the cost aspect?
So really, there's a misconception that timber always costs more, and that's because people are probably scared and haven't used it, so then they think, contractors are going to price in more for it. But if you get the right team, like Simon and Ryan said, if you get the right builders that have used it before, there are savings in prelims. So if you're using it on a big structure where there's lots of, CRT, most of the columns and beams are timber, and glulam, then it actually could have prelim savings. So if you could save, 2 months of prelims for using timber, you could save $2 million, because prelims cost could be like $1 million a month. So it's really
that's considerable.
Exactly.
It's considerable. Yeah.
It is considerable. A lot of the times when us as QSs price things, we just look at the material costs. So sometimes it is looking at the prelims and working it back to first principles. So. The misconception that timber costs more is not always the case. Plus, there are benefits, like the whole team has spoken about, ESD. It's whether or not the client wants to go down that path as well. So there's a lot of benefits with going with timber, and also it looks great. So there's also that physical aspect, which is probably why JCB like to use CRT and glulam.
It's lovely to inhabit a timber building as well, isn't it? Not just aesthetically, but it also feels really good as well.
Yeah. And I also saw Grant Hobson asked a question just with the New Student Precinct project. It was up to 10 months. So that kind of scared the team away from timber, because New Student Precinct opposite the site was Melbourne Connect. And I think there was potentially delays of up to 10 months, which really kind of scared our client, Melbourne Uni. And then that's probably why we didn't go down that path, just because of timing. But I think just being aware of all of those things and planning will ensure that we do more timber buildings.
Yeah.
It's probably worth mentioning on that. At the moment, buildings under 25 metres you can put through as a deemed satisfied solution and go through the fire brigade and not end up with the Building Appeals Board, where some of the larger projects, the MFB are currently referring those to the Building Appeals Board once you go over 25. So some of the larger multi-storey, and that's where that risk in terms of time frame can really come into play.
Yeah.
I think that, like, one of the key things in terms of procurement is don't just walk down the design road and think that you can procure a timber building in the same way that you approach a normal building. Like, because the reality is you do have a significant amount of time from sign off of shop drawings to point of time that the first panels are on site. So you need to be thinking, and that can be anywhere from 12 weeks if they're supplied in Australia to 20 if they're supplied overseas. So you need to think about ECI. You need to think about doing the shop drawings almost for the timber before you even go out to tender. You need to be thinking about different models, and that just comes down to having project managers who've maybe done it before or are open to looking at different solutions that can take clients on the path and de-risk those big sort of program items that I think that's where a lot of projects fall into strife, because suddenly they're going down a traditional tender road and they end up finding out, on day one of as soon as the contract comes on board and says, well, we're not going to have a panel here for 12 weeks. And we need to have it here in 4. So you've got to think about procurement differently.
Yeah. So thinking about procurement differently, bearing in mind that, Lisa, as you've said, it actually doesn't necessarily cost any more. Nigel, you've obviously had a lot of experience working here and also internationally on timber projects. How do you think the Australian industry needs to change to try and, I suppose, bring more awareness and facilitate more opportunities for mass timber buildings to happen?
It's important to understand that timber lends itself heavily to D&C. Like, it is effectively can be thought about similar to a facade package in many respects. The specialist timber supplier has their own species, their own fabrication capabilities. They have their own sizes. They prefer to make connection preferences. So it heavily lends itself to a D&C model, which is a very comfortable model in the Australian landscape, to be honest. The trick is how you get that input early enough in the design process, really. And as was touched on a little bit earlier, I think the ECI, early contractor input model, is proving to be a pretty successful one, whereby you get to scheme design, for example, and you either bring on board a main contractor that has a timber supplier on board. The advantage of that is that they can give you a more holistic view they can bring in the timber input, the specialist timber input, and the pricing information from the timber supplier, but they can also price the bigger picture, how that fits into the overall program, and what benefits that'll get. Or you can simply bring in, the timber supplier in isolation, effectively, and use them as a sort of a specialist consultant to help firm up the price. And I've worked in a scenario where they've been basically a nominated subcontractor, for example. But either way, that ECI model works very well, I think, for kicking off the sort of input from the timber supplier early in the piece. And then, you've still got the flexibility if you want to go out D&C and keep the sort of competitive tension. And, that's a pretty important element of the Australian market, the competitive nature of it. And we're certainly, Ryan and I are, exploring projects at the moment, looking at that model, and it seems to be working pretty effectively.
Yeah.
I think picking up from that in terms of the level of coordination as well, working in a timber building, I mean, Nigel and his team at AECOM, working both post and beam projects at the moment. At the end of schematic design, the level of design resolution we had was quite incredible. I mean, down to services reticulation and everything else was resolved to make sure that, in a floor-to-floor height of whatever we had, 3.8 or whatever it was, that the services could work, and we weren't going into planning with a building envelope that then was insufficient. And then what that also helped us to do is when you mention an ECI to a client, they always get a little bit hesitant because they think they're not going to get any competition from the market, that, builders pricing one-on-one, and then they'll essentially take the piss, so to speak, when it comes to converting it into a contract. So getting that level of design at the end of schematic design, what that helped us to actually do is then take it out to market and get the builders to actually price in a GMP. And testament to the quality of the documents we produced was the spread was sort of plus or minus 3% on the QS's estimate, which is quite incredible as well. And then that then allowed us to sort of set out, well, this is your GMP price on a DNC. Now we'll get into DD. And here's the target price you need to hit as sort of an incentive for the builder to work towards as well. So that the design input and the coordination you put in on the front end really does benefit the procurement opportunities and options it gives you to carry the project forward.
Yeah. I can see we've actually already got quite a few questions coming in from guests. So I'm going to just read out some of these questions and I'll put it to the panel. And I've got a couple of questions myself. So we'll come back to those if we do run out, but just so that we can make sure we do answer some of these questions. What is the cycle structure time per floor for, say, a 2,000 square metre floor plate once the standard floors are established? And how do you compare these? Because you may also have divisional walls completed simultaneously. Is that that's a question
That's
from
a
our
very
friend.
specific question.
That is Grant Hobson has asked this question. He's a dear collaborator of ours, and I think if we can try and answer that question for Grant, that would be fabulous.
No, I think I might be able to jump in there. So it'll be a bit different depending on a post and beam building compared to say a panelized CLT building like Peninsula. For Collingwood, I think the estimated number of lifts per level is about 179. I can't remember the cycle time. I think it might have been 9 days, and the floor plate's not too far away from 2,000 square meters.
Yeah, about that.
I think.
Yeah. So when we were looking at the costs and sort of time savings, comparing a concrete structure to a timber structure on Gillies Hall, I think it was about a 2.5 month saving we had on that building.
Yeah.
But given the nature of the post and beam and the hook time that you need to take lift all the columns and beams into place, a concrete building sort of ends up being comparable in terms of program, which I think good in as well.
Gillies Hall, which is roughly 1,000 square metre floor plate, the hardest job is actually getting off the concrete deck because you're literally bolting down into concrete. And it was the first learning of multiplex, and I won't go into, I can't remember the specific number of lifts exactly, but I know by the time they were cycling to the final floor level, they were doing almost half an entire floor a day in terms of lifts, in terms of finishing. So they were literally able to cycle through a floor in less than probably about 3 days on a 1,000 square metre floor. So it becomes incredibly fast by the end once everybody's in tune. And I saw that again on the Trove. They were moving incredibly fast towards the end of the project, and that was probably a more complicated sort of floor plate system.
So is it quicker to build with mass timber once you're up and running?
Much quicker.
Yep.
Much quicker. Yeah.
So I guess that's,
Yeah,
I mean,
incredibly fast. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a big advantage, obviously. And given, Lisa, your commentary around the fact that there could be cost savings, in fact, it means that there's no, significant impost with cost. What, and there's sustainability benefits as well. Are there any other benefits to building in mass timber that may not be obvious to the general, industry person who's listening in today?
So I personally haven't worked on big, large, I guess commercial buildings, but some towers, if you go with timber, it's actually lighter. So Nigel could probably elaborate, but it could be more feasible for a project, or make a project feasible if you did go timber. So instead of going 10 floors, it could be 20 floors with timber. So that's a consideration for some projects.
Yeah, the lightweight nature of timber really lends itself to poor soil sites if you've got challenging geotechnical situations, or if you're wanting to do building extensions, because if you've got limited capacity on the existing building, the lightweight nature of it really sort of plays into that. The other thing is, you tend to have less truck movements, and it tends to be incredibly quiet on the sites. So the Ballarat Gov Hub, you go on site, when they had the concrete levels going, there were 30 people on the floor plate and concrete trucks. When they were doing the timber, it's virtually silent. A few guys knocking in a nail, or putting in some screws, and it was a completely different experience that far less people on site, far less movements of vehicles, and far quieter. So yeah, those are two obvious benefits.
Yeah, that's good for the neighbours, I guess. The
Yeah.
noise factor.
That is a massive sell to Monash as well, to try to get the sort of the PCG across the line on timber, was that it's not the benefits to the project itself, but the building's located next to existing stock of student accommodation on site, classrooms, lecture theatres, and other residential neighbours as well. So the explanation that, all you're going to hear is, didn't mention that, there was going to be a diesel crane on site, but aside from that, the only noise they would hear was just a few screwdrivers. Screwdrivers.
And that's pretty good for COVID as well, because if there's less people on site, a lot of its prefab comes in, just gets installed on sites a lot quicker. So
yeah, that is a good benefit.
Yeah.
Another question from our audience. One of the participants or attendees has asked, which builders in Melbourne are currently working across these projects? So I think, Simon, you said you've been working with Multiplex on a couple of your projects. Have anyone else had experience with other builders apart from Multiplex?
Yeah, so Kane Nicholson joint venture, we're doing Ballarat GovHub, and also Watpac are currently underway on Geelong Civic Centre, which we've got a client-side role on. So there really is, the tier twos are all now getting in and doing their second sort of, their first project and getting one under their belt, which that's a really big stepping stone for it as well.
Absolutely.
It's not just about getting the supply, the local supply. You need the builders also getting the runs on the board and getting their first one. And the first one's, relatively tough. There's a learning curve for everyone, but everyone sort of unanimously comes through that first experience with a very, very positively, and is much better positioned for the second subsequent projects. And really, the majority of the major builders are all got points on the board now.
Yeah,
and it's the subtle. I was going to say the subtleties as well. The follow-on trades from those builders, once they've done one, they realise, like, you got your fire services guys who are fitting off. They can come in the next day after a floor plate's gone in. In a concrete building, it's 4 to 6 weeks later, and they're fixing into concrete. In a mass timber building, they're screwing into timber the day after it's been installed, and that's every other trade. Is you're fixing off into timber. So everybody who's working on site loves it because it's flexible, easy to work with.
Yeah.
So I think down the track, where you're going to see those follow-on trades actually then pricing timber buildings more competitively, just by the very nature of they're actually easier to work in.
And the few projects that we've focused on in terms of discussion today have been with institutional clients. Generally, there's been a couple noted there that were confidential. Has anyone had experience, or are there any examples or completed within Australia with mass timber for retail? In the retail setting, not yet. Everyone's thinking.
No, there's nothing that comes into mind. There is an aquatic centre in Canberra, though, with some amazing glulam beams that span over the swimming pool that Kane completed. That looks absolutely stunning. Yeah, but not retail that I've seen.
Well, that's okay. We've closed out those questions, which is great for the audience.
There was one question in there, if you don't mind me picking up, just in terms of what are the issues with getting approvals with the Building Appeals Board, which I think is sort of a key issue for the industry and probably good topic of conversation. I should probably kick it off with how long have you got, because we could be here all afternoon. So I think, as Simon touched on, at the moment, under the BCA, a building with an effective height of 25 metres, if it's fully enclosed, is deemed to satisfy, and then the brigade is willing to assess it, even if it's an exposed building. But the issue at the moment is, as soon as you exceed 25 metres of effective height, the go-to statement is get it approved by the Building Appeals Board. The issue there is it takes about 12 months to get an outcome out of the board. There's been 4 projects that have gone in. 55 South Bank Boulevard is one project that's been approved. All the others have been rejected. So when Nigel and I and Chris from JCB as well trying to save the timber dream on Collingwood and trying to explain to the client that we might be facing a 12-month delay for the building appeals board, and that is not a palatable outcome for anybody, because as we all know, time is money. What's disheartening is that the outcomes coming out of the board aren't specifically all timber related. They relate to other inherent issues in the building, and the building happens to be timber. Which then, where the brigade want a precedent set by the board for them to then assess projects on their merit moving forward, that's not really helpful to the timber industry. So I think as an industry in property and construction, what we need to move towards is establish with the brigade, bring in some industry bodies and minds who do have the knowledge of mass timber, and establish sort of a strategy or a roadmap, if you will, seeing that that's sort of one of the keywords through COVID is a roadmap. So establish a roadmap for a timber approval. So before you lodge, you need to have tested X, demonstrated Y, and be compliant with Z, and hit these targets to get towards an approval, rather than sit around for 12 months not knowing what's going to come out of the board. Yeah.
And so if those things were then satisfied, Ryan, what you're suggesting is it would be a much quicker process to get it approved and get moving.
Yes, because at the moment, the outcome from the board is generally confidential. So, it's normally conversations with others where you get an idea of what the outcome was. So for the industry to get together and go, yes, can we go higher than 25 meters? Yes, because they have done that elsewhere in the world. So what's stopping us from doing it locally? What do we need to do to make sure that we're designing buildings in a compliant way above 25 meters? And just put some guidance and guidance around it, because submitting to the board, you're going in open-ended, you don't know what the key issues that concern them are.
Yep.
You lodge, you wait 12 months, you're rejected, you're back at square one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's the BAB process is a completely woeful tool for doing this. It was not intended to be approving full timber buildings. It was supposed to be looking at sort of specific non-compliance issues on individual buildings. And when we're looking at a whole timber building, the lack of transparency in terms of timeframes and outcomes is really hurting us. But part of the reason why we have this issue is also just because of the codified and statutory framework that enables us to demonstrate compliance is still developing. And there's movement on that front. There's the new Euro code that's about to come out, which is will aid in that in a way, and will provide some more guidance. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. I think the industry needs to really get together and put a bit of pressure on relating to this BAB situation. But we also need to be working hard on the technical, proving it up from a technical perspective, getting fire testing done, looking at international codes, and demonstrating sort of technical compliance in that route as well to aid it as well. So it's a sort of a two-pronged approach, I think.
Mm-hmm. I'm just conscious of time. We've got 10 minutes until probably most people will sign off. We've got a question from our pal Davin. I'll just read it out. I'm an enthusiastic advocate of CLT and glulam, but found that waterproofing is the biggest challenge to ensure long-term durability of the structure. Does anyone on the panel, so over to you guys, have any thoughts on how to improve the waterproofing systems and keeping moisture out of the areas that are not visible for routine inspections? Simon's looking up where the rain's coming from.
I am. I was told by my old boss as a grad that we got two responsibilities as an architect: is make the buildings stand up and not fall in decline, and two, keep them dry.
Yeah, I think so.
So it sounds like Davin's having a bit of trouble with both in a way. I mean, I think buildings just have to be detailed well. You just got to use the right membranes and the right systems. I mean, we've probably on our projects we've worked with Rotherblast, who are experts in timber accessories, and that goes from screws to membranes to to pads, to tapes that go on the bottom of the panels to ensure that water doesn't come up through the slab. Like, you've got to be using the right accessories, and that's pretty fundamental. You've got to be detailing them right. Nigel, have you got any comment on that further?
Yeah, well, typically timber is used in its final, softwood in its final condition is used behind the weatherproofing line. But I think one element that builders need to really work with is how to deal with it during the construction process.
Yeah.
And that has been something that's been challenging for builders, because I see a timber floor is actually not waterproof. If it rains on it, the water doesn't just pond on it, it goes through the gaps. And you can find that unless you are managing that can be problematic. And, that's some of the learnings we've had from Ballarat GovHub. And there are means of doing that. You can put on a membrane every third level and create a degree of waterproofness to sort of draw lines in the sand as you build. So there's ways of doing that. But I think dealing with water during the construction is something that's solvable, but it's certainly something that the builders are having to wrestle with, which is something they've never ever thought about. A PT floor plate, who cares? You pour your floor, the water gets on it, drips off the sides, who cares about that sort of thing? So that from my experience has been something that needs to get addressed.
And the typical moisture content in mass timber, I believe, is something like 18%. Don't quote me on that number, but it's there or thereabouts. And the real concern is during construction, it's a timber that you are going to enclose. And you can get moisture meters. You just sort of pin right in the timber, and it tells you, calculates in what the moisture content is. So then something key that Multi did on Gillies Hall was before the plasterers went through, the grads were running around with moisture meters, just pinning all the walls, just making sure that the moisture content was at an acceptable level before it was lined over. And if you're lining, you in a weather-tight building anyway, generally.
One last question, which is my own personal question for the panel. We've talked about mass timber with the institutional projects. We've had Catherine's question around whether there's any retail examples, and I note that actually Daniela, who's attended today, has said the Canberra precinct in ANU includes 2 timber construction buildings. So that's just FYI for all of those listening in. Thank you, Daniela. But my question, I suppose, is specifically around multi-residential and getting, I suppose, developers to come along on the journey, residential developers, be clear, to come along on the journey for mass timber. And over to the panel, I guess, why would a developer choose to do mass timber or not choose to do mass timber? I mean, are there any examples of multi-res projects in Melbourne or Australia that have used mass timber as part of the structure?
Well, Forte was the very first one that Lend-Lease did in the Docklands back in the day. AVO
have done enormous retirement living buildings in Sydney using mass timber as well, which is a really good example. Like, you're talking sort of, they were 8-9 story, was all encapsulated. I think it comes back to there's absolutely no reason why not. Like, the cellular construction of, say, of Gillies Hall and Latrobe is perfectly, CLT is perfectly suited to the cellular construction of multi-res that's cost comparable. It's really just about dealing with those issues, how much you're going to expose, and the value, I think, as a developer in terms of showing leadership and sustainability and leadership,
absolutely,
and having that value add, and that's where that kernel would come for a multi-res developer. Yes, there's possibilities of doing the projects quicker, which is always going to be about time, and you can close out your sales quicker. But ultimately, they're going to be able to put, actually literally market the low carbon credentials of the project and the embodied carbon. And I think the embodied carbon discussion is going to become much more vocal as we move forward. It's starting to really sort of gain traction now, and people are really questioning the embodied carbon in projects. And in mass timber, aside from the fact that the timber does store carbon for the lifespan of its building, it is it's got an incredibly light carbon footprint to manufacture and bring to site in comparison to concrete and steel. And as Nigel alluded to, it's probably the biggest contributor to carbon on any construction project, and carbon in construction contributes the biggest footprint, worldwide, is one of the biggest footprints. And it's actually the thing we don't talk about. We talk about jet planes, and we talk about cars, and we talk about cows farting. And it's amazing. We don't talk about concrete. And mass timber it's not going to be the only tool in the weapon, but it's it's a really good tool that we can pivot to relatively easily and deliver. We need to build a lot of housing, and this is a way of actually building it sustainably.
Yep.
So
I think it does lend itself to residential construction. The wall and floor system is comparatively straightforward, and we found in the commercial office space there's more challenges with coordination and more servicing requirements. It becomes more of a multidisciplinary undertaking. But we've done MacArthur Art Gardens up in Sydney. We've done a development in Adelaide for residential. We've done several, and they've been pretty successful. So it's absolutely possible, but it also does require a commitment from a residential developer to invest a little bit more upfront in consultants. As a structural engineer, we would generally get very, very little engagement up to town planning, on the assumption that the architect, if he knows what he's doing, could probably put in place a grid and a 200 thick flat plate in roughly the right place. But you can't do that in a timber development. You really need the team together right from the get-go to get it to click before you go to planning. And it's just making that investment right up front and committing to it and making sure you get your ducks in a row. Yeah.
Well, so we just need someone, a Melbourne developer, to lead the charge then. Sorry, Ryan, did you have something to close off on that?
I was just gonna pick it up on Nigel's point, just saying, just the commitment of the team, just from the front, from schematic design, from your fire engineers and building surveyors to the architect to the client. It's just the commitment of the team that really drives the success of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, at 1:57, I'd like to say thank you to our panel for attending, and thank you to everyone who has dialed in today. It's been a lovely and very informative discussion, and I hope that everyone has enjoyed listening to Lisa, Nigel, Ryan and Simon. Thank you to our panel, and thanks for coming along.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers, bye.